Hey students, I'm glad you're here for the Friday recap. We are in the middle of this series going through the Bible each week, reading through the Word. And this week we're in week 16 in our Word reading plan. We've read some in 1 Kings, we read some in Proverbs, and then some in Ecclesiastes. And so we've been looking a lot at the life of Solomon, son of David. And so today, just like we've done for the last several weeks, we're going to just look through what we've read so far, give like a really brief overview, 30,000 foot view of what we've read up until today. And then tomorrow's reading, I encourage you to read that on your own tomorrow. But you know, the Friday recap is all about, let's get caught up. If you haven't been engaged in the reading plan, let's get caught up so that you can continue forward in your reading plan as you go forward. But also just to kind of, if you have been reading, just a little reminder of what we have read. So let's recap through. We read on Monday, 1 Kings chapter 2. And what we see, the biggest thing we see in that is that David's nearing the end of his life, and he calls Solomon to him, and he gives him instructions on how to lead well, how to continue on this legacy that David has begun. And then we see David end up dying, and Solomon's reign, his leadership as king, is established, right? It begins right there. And then we see in chapter 3 and 6, those are the next two chapters that we read. We read 1 Kings 3 and 6 on Tuesday. Chapter 3 is the chapter where Solomon is basically, God gives him a blank check to ask for whatever he wants. And Solomon doesn't ask for riches. He doesn't ask for, a long life. He asks for wisdom. And God ends up giving him everything he could ever want, but also makes him the wisest man to ever walk the earth. And from that, we get the book of Proverbs, right? Like that book of wisdom is an outpouring of that wisdom that God imparted on Solomon. And so chapter 3, prays for wisdom, receives wisdom. And then we see just an example of how God gave him a test to prove his wisdom in a judgment there at the end of chapter 3. And then chapter 6, we see the building of the temple, where it's something that had been a long time coming, right? A lot of people had wanted to do it, had planned to do it, and it's finally happening. The building of the temple to house, where people could encounter God, where sacrifices could be offered, where the presence of God dwelled there in the Holy of Holies, all this. So the temple ends up being built, chapter 6. And then we read chapter 8, we're in chapter 8 and then part of chapter 9 on Wednesday. And chapter 8 is where the ark is brought into the temple. So the presence of God, that symbolism of the presence of God, is brought into the temple there in chapter 8. And then we just see this dialogue between Solomon and the Lord, where there's just this prayer of dedication. But it's just as I was reading, it was just an awesome conversation that God was just reminding me that that's not limited to just King Solomon. Those conversations, those dialogues, those moments where we can learn, where we can speak to God and God can speak to us spirit to spirit, happen in our lives as well, not just in Solomon's. So that was chapter 8. And then we, and something else that kind of stood out is through that time, you see all these different sacrifices. They said the sacrifices were so many that they couldn't even number them. Like that's the kind of, worship that they were offering to the Lord, that they were sacrificing, as an atonement for their sins. But it was so many sacrifices that they couldn't even number them. That the sacrifice was so great. And then in chapter 9, we've got the Lord appearing to Solomon and essentially telling him, hey, if you'll follow me, I will continue what I started. I've said that I've got this covenant between all of your ancestors, and your reign will last forever. Essentially he's talking about Jesus, and he says, if you follow me, this will happen. If you don't, it won't, right? And so God's telling him this, and it's just this moment of God just telling him how things are about to go down if he continues to follow the Lord. Then we read Proverbs 1 and Proverbs 3. Again, Proverbs, as I mentioned a second ago, was written by Solomon. And this is an outpouring of all of the wisdom that God gave Solomon. And so we read Proverbs 1 and Proverbs 3. And I'll say this, Proverbs is kind of difficult to summarize in a lot of ways because Proverbs is a book full of wisdom. It's a book of Proverbs, these statements, these short verse or 2 verse statements of wisdom. And so it's kind of difficult to summarize because Proverbs contains so many different themes and ideas and all these different things going on. But I would encourage you to read Proverbs 1 and 3. If you have not read it this week, there's so much in there. We see where he talks about the beginning of knowledge coming from fear of the Lord. That's where knowledge starts, is from fear of the Lord. Is this reverence of understanding who God is and the kind of power that he has. And we see all these different things in Proverbs 1 and 3. And then we read Ecclesiastes 1 and 3 as well. And so in Ecclesiastes 1 and 3, we just see these statements from Solomon where he's talking about just the fleeting world and that all the things that you think are important aren't important. But what is God? God is the most important thing. And God is the one thing that's not changing. And so Ecclesiastes kind of highlights a lot of that. And again, it's kind of negative, it's kind of depressing, but then it also highlights what is important, and it's the Lord and the things that God is doing. So if you're reading the Word of God with us, we encourage you to continue doing that. If you haven't yet, join in with us. We'd love to have you. Y'all have a great week, and we'll see you on Sunday.